Hey there, YouTube viewers. This show is available as a podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Just search for Unexplained Encounters and give us a follow. Thank you. Do you ever get the feeling that a certain person you've encountered just isn't actually human? What if there are human-looking things out there that simply aren't one of us? The following story is titled, "It Wears Human Skin." It's from a viewer with the pen name Garlini. It's one of the more unsettling stories I've read in a while. He claims to be a park ranger for an unspecified national forest. Things can be weird out there at times, but a series of events with striking similarity seems to prove that there is something out there in the American wilderness, and it loves to wear human skins. Forgive me because I'm no writer. I'm not very good at telling stories. In the past couple of weeks, I've typed this out about 4 times, deleting the previous ones. This is basically just the version I stopped editing, the version I settled on. So, I'm a park ranger. I've been with the National Park Service for almost 8 years, all of it in the same district in the Northwest. For obvious reasons, I can't name the park, and I can't give my real name. But if you work in NPS and you're reading this, you either already know who I am, or you've heard a version of what I'm about to describe. And in that case, I would appreciate it if you kept it to yourself. I'm doing this to get the word out. I think people should know. My dad was the one who got me this job. He was a ranger in the same district for about 26 years before I started, which is how I even knew the posting was available. He called me one day and told me that they had an opening, and that the application window was short. I was 23 and working at a hardware store in Bremerton, going nowhere in particular with my life. So I applied. Now I wish I could say there was something romantic about it, some deep love of the outdoors that pulled me in, but truthfully, my dad handed me a life and I took it because I didn't have one of my own yet. I grew up visiting him on the job, weekend rides in the duty truck, helping him restock trail registers and eating peanut butter sandwiches on the tailgate, while he filled out paperwork. I liked those visits. What I didn't understand until I was actually doing the work myself was that those visits were curated. Dad only brought me along on the easiest of days. He never took me on a body recovery, for example, or out to look for a lost child or a 3-hour bushwhack to tag an injured elk for Fish and Wildlife. Basically, the version of the job I grew up seeing with him was a highlight reel, and I didn't really find that out until I was already on payroll. I should tell you that I'm not built for this work, not the way he was. Dad could spend 4 days alone in the backcountry and would come back looking 10 years younger. On the other hand, I spend one night in a fire lookout and my hands shake for an hour the next morning. I've been on sertraline since I was 19. I check the locks on my duty cabin twice before bed, then I check them again when I get up to use the bathroom at 2 a.m. I know the second check is pointless because I did it 3 hours ago and nobody has come in since. But I do it anyway because my brain needs the confirmation that everything is safe and secure. That's how my mind works. And I manage it. Most days I'm fine. I do my job well enough. Nobody's ever had a complaint about me yet. My performance reviews would say things like reliable and thorough, which are the words people use when they mean you're not exciting but you do show up. Now let's truly get into the story. The first thing happened in my second year. Early September, the tail end of hiking season. It's around the time the days are still warm out, but the light starts dropping off fast after 5. We got a report from a woman at the main trailhead lot that her husband had not come back. He had left that morning for a day hike on one of the eastern loops, a 12-mile trail with moderate difficulty. The man was 44 years old and was experienced. He had done the route before, too. He told her he'd be back by 4, and at 7, she called us. This happens more than people think. Usually the hiker miscalculates time or twists an ankle, or just sits down somewhere pretty and loses track of the afternoon. 9 times out of 10, they walk out on their own, sheepish and apologetic, and you meet them on the trail with a flashlight, while they're already heading back. Anyway, we started the search at first light the next morning. There were 4 two-person teams fanning out from the trailhead, each covering a section of the loop and the surrounding off-trail areas. I was paired with another ranger named Colby. Colby's a seasonal guy in his second summer who talked too much and hiked too fast. We were covering a section off the main trail, the east side, where the loop cuts close to a gully that feeds into the creek system below. It's dense in there. Think Douglas fir, western red cedar, ferns up past your waist in some spots. Lots of deadfall, too. Big old trunks gone soft with rot that crumble when you step on them. Not a place a day hiker would normally wander into. But we check everywhere because lost people don't go where they're supposed to, obviously. Colby was about 30 yards ahead of me, working a line closer to the trail, when I pushed through a stand of sword ferns and looked down into the gully. I found the body around 10 a.m. It was lying face up at the bottom of the gully, about 50 yards off the trail, settled into the ferns, like someone had put it there. It was flat on its back, arms at its sides, legs straight. The first thing that registered with me was how pale the skin was, but evenly pale. Like the color on the skin had been mixed in a bucket, then painted perfectly. There was no mottling or lividity, no discoloration or bruises. But then I saw the face. The mouth was open, real wide, far wider than normal, living or dead. I checked later and the joint was intact, no dislocation or displacement. The mouth was just stretched open, like the muscles that should have held it shut had simply stopped existing. The lips were pulled back from the gums, and the teeth were gone, most of them. They were scattered on the ground around the head, in the ferns and the dirt, like someone had dropped a handful of chiclets into the grass. I could see them, small and white, on the brown mulch. Some of them still had the roots attached, long, pale, tapered roots, intact and whole. They'd come out clean from the inside, it looked like, pushed outward through the gums. A few of them had landed 6 inches from the face. Whatever had forced them out had done it with enough pressure to scatter them. I called this in. Then I sat down on a mossy log about 20 feet away and waited nervously. When you find a body, you mark the GPS, you radio the coordinates, and you don't touch anything. A few minutes later, Colby came crashing through the brush. I told him to stay back, and he did, though he kept craning his neck trying to see past me into the gully. I told him he shouldn't look, but he looked anyway. He didn't say anything after that, which was the quietest he'd been all summer. I sat on that log for 45 minutes waiting for the recovery team. Colby stood about 10 yards behind me, texting on his phone, which technically wasn't supposed to get reception out here, but sometimes it did. I spent most of that wait trying to figure out what was bothering me, beyond the obvious. It took me a while, but then I realized it was the smell. There was no smell. A body in the woods in September, even one that's only been there overnight, should smell like something. Maybe not rot yet, but there's biology to it still. The system shuts down when you die. Sweat, waste, and the first stages of bacterial work. I've had the unfortunate pleasure of experiencing the heaviness in the air around a fresh body. And you notice that, even if you can't name it at the time. I'd been on 2 other body recoveries by then, both exposure cases from the previous winter found in the spring thaw. And both times, the smell was what told me I was close before I ever saw the bodies. This one had nothing. I was 20 feet away and the air smelled like dirt and wet ferns. To my scent, it was just the smell of the morning fog burning off the canopy. The body was not, well, participating in the forest around it. It was like it was part of the scenery, a prop someone had left on the ground. The other thing I noticed while I sat there was the complete lack of insects. Again, I'll remind you this was September in the northwest, in a gully with standing water and decaying plant matter. How were there no insects? Mosquitoes had been chewing on me and Colby since we left the truck. I had 3 bites on my neck alone, but the body had nothing on it. Nothing crawling on it or buzzing around the open mouth or eyes. Flies will find a dead animal in the woods within minutes. I'd been sitting there close to an hour, and that body was untouched. Like to nature, this was not a food source. Nature itself was treating it like it wasn't even biological. The recovery team hiked in around noon. They bagged it and carried it out, and I went back to the trailhead, doing my paperwork in the bed of my truck. I liked doing that because my office felt too small and too inside. Then I drove home and sat down for a while, waiting for my leg to stop bouncing. Here's the catch. That body did not match the missing hiker. Different build. The hiker was 6'1", broad-shouldered, a weekend weightlifter according to his wife. The body was slight, 5'8" at most, with a narrow frame. Completely different estimated age, maybe late 20s against the hiker's 44. They had different hair colors too. When the dental records came back, what was left to compare anyway, they didn't even match anyone in any database. Same thing with the fingerprint match. No missing persons report anywhere in the state fit the description. The medical examiner's report said cause of death was undetermined. They could find no trauma, no toxicology, no disease, no signs of exposure, no evidence of animal predation. The notes mentioned the jaw and the teeth, but framed it as anomalous post-mortem changes of unknown etiology. I read that phrase in the report and remember thinking it was a very comfortable way to say, I have no idea what happened here, and I'd like to stop thinking about it. There was one other thing in the ME's notes that I didn't understand until later. Under internal examination, a single line was there. Absence of expected organ weight. Thoracic and abdominal cavities presented without significant visceral mass. Noted for further review. Even after reading it 3 times, it still didn't click. I mean, I'm not a medical professional, so I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I didn't know what without significant visceral mass meant in practice. It would be years before I understood what that examiner was saying. That, in the most cautious language possible, they were saying the body was mostly empty. That further review part never even happened, as far as I know. The case stayed open, nobody closed it, and nobody pursued it. It just stopped moving. The missing hiker, the 44-year-old husband, he was never found. His wife called the station every week for 2 months straight, then every other week, then once a month, then she stopped. I wasn't the one who took her calls, but I was in the office for some of them, and the sound of someone's hope thinning out is not something I like to describe. You could hear it in the pauses between her questions, because those gaps got longer. No one connected the body in the gully to the missing hiker, because there was nothing to connect. It was a different person entirely, as far as anyone could tell. 2 unrelated events that happened to occur in the same area at roughly the same time. Coincidence or bad luck? Just the woods doing what the woods can do to people. Now, my dad was still alive back then, still working the district, same as he had been since before I was born. He was 58 years old, and his knees were starting to go, but he still hiked faster than anyone under 30 on the staff. I told him about the body over dinner a few nights after. Just the broad strokes. The teeth, the jaw, the ME's non-answer. He listened closely, never interrupting. He kept his eyes fixed on mine the whole time, and stopped moving his fork. Eventually, when I was done, he said something to me like, 26 years and I've seen a dozen things I couldn't explain. The woods don't run on our schedule, and they don't owe us any answers. He said stuff like that. I don't think he meant it to be dismissive. He just had a way of putting things in a box and pressing the lid down flat, stacking something heavy on top afterwards. And when he did it, you believed the box would stay shut, and you wanted it to. So I let it stay shut. I was 2 years into a job I wasn't even sure I could handle on a good day, and I had a father who could look at the inexplicable and simply shrug. I wanted more than anything to be someone who could do that too. So I hid that memory in the same place I put all my memories that threatened to crack the floor I'm standing on. Somewhere so deep down that even the medication won't touch it. For a while, that worked fine. My dad died 14 months later. It was pancreatic cancer, caught too late. Apparently, pancreatic cancer is quite sneaky like that. He went from diagnosis to gone in about 11 weeks. I'm not going to write too much about this. After all, it's not what the post is about, because I still can't do it without my hands starting up again. I'll say this, he didn't complain, and he wasn't scared. On the last day he was conscious, he asked me how the trail conditions were looking for spring. That's just my dad. He died and I stayed in the district, and I kept doing the job. It kept me distracted. People told me he would be proud of me for keeping the job. Maybe. I think he'd be more confused than proud, honestly. He knew I was scared of everything. He just had the grace to never say it out loud. The next few years were quiet. I did my routes, took my meds. I got to know the other rangers who cycled in and out. Some of them were good, but some of them were just passing through on the way to get better posting. I found a rhythm that worked, as long as nothing disrupted it, which is another way of saying I built a life out of holding very still, hoping nothing noticed me. That body in the gully I found, set in my mental box, and the lid still held. But I did think about it sometimes, late at night when the cabin settled, those moments when your brain decides sleep just isn't happening. But thinking about something and doing something about it are very different activities, and I've always been better at the first one. 4 years went by. Then they found the second one. Before I go on, let me talk about Philip and Richard. Philip Herrera started the same year my dad died. He was 24 at the time, fresh out of a forestry program. He could sit next to you at lunch for half an hour without saying a word, and you'd somehow enjoy the company. But he wasn't exactly shy. He just didn't start conversations. But if you initiated one with him, he'd ride it wherever you wanted to go, and he would remember the details weeks later. He once asked me a follow-up question about something I'd mentioned in passing about my truck's transmission 3 months after I said it. The thing about Philip was the horror stuff. He was into it. Some dudes like fly fishing, hunting, but Philip liked scary stuff. Creepypasta, folklore, paranormal podcasts, VHS-era slasher films, the whole shebang. He had a bookshelf in his cabin that was half field guides, and the rest was paperback horror anthologies with cracked spines. When he first started, whenever he would meet a ranger in the district for the first time, he would ask them what the strangest thing they'd ever experienced on the job was, the only time he really initiated conversations. Most folks gave him nothing. It was stuff like weird noises or a tree that fell awkward, or the rudest hiker you've ever heard. He wrote all of it down in a little notebook. I was no exception. He asked me too. I had told him about the time I found a boot on the trail with no foot in it, and no owner anywhere nearby. I didn't tell him about the body in the gully though. Not sure why. Maybe because the boot story fit neatly in Philip's notebook, and the body could stay in the box. Then there's Richard K. He had been in the district for about 3 years by the time the second body turned up. He was 33, had previously did something with insurance in Portland that he never talked about, and I always assumed that meant he didn't like it. He transferred to NPS through some career change program, and took to it immediately. Richard was the guy who packed an extra Cliff Bar in case you forgot yours. He'd give you his rain shell if yours was in the truck. He named the chipmunks around the station and got genuinely upset whenever one of them stopped showing up. He was very soft-hearted, almost to a fault, but it was so genuine that it never really got there. The man cared about things openly and without embarrassment, and being around him made you think, dang, I wish I was like that. The three of us weren't best friends. We were co-workers who liked each other, which I think is its own rare and specific thing. We would eat lunch together when our schedules overlapped, and we would carpool to the grocery run in town sometimes. One time, Richard lent me a book once, and he never asked for it back. Philip and I watched a Mariners game at his cabin one night, but neither of us said much. But that was fine. We were three dudes who were comfortable around each other, and it didn't need to be more than that. It was my 6th year, in late October. A couple in their 30s had reserved a backcountry campsite on the North Fork Trail, a 2-night permit. When they didn't check out on their scheduled date, and their car was still in the lot the following morning, a search was initiated. Their campsite was found and intact. The tent was still staked, and there were sleeping bags inside, a cook kit hanging from the bear wire. There were 2 packs leaning against a log, food still in the canister, untouched. We could not find any sign of a struggle, no sign of anything at all. It looked like 2 people had stepped away to get water and never came back. The car in the lot had a coffee mug in the cup holder with a ring of dried milk in the bottom. I was on the search team with a ranger named Gillette. We were working a grid pattern north of the campsite, pushing through heavy brush along a deer trail that followed a ridgeline. About a quarter mile out, in a thicket of salal and Oregon grapes so dense I had to turn sideways to get through it, I saw the body. My legs stopped working for a second, genuinely. My brain sent the signal and my legs said no. I knew what I was looking at before I consciously processed any of it. The skin, the color, and that same flat, even mannequin pallor. A body lying on its back in the brush with its arms at its side and its mouth wide open. I stood there for about 10 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in the field with your partner 20 yards away calling your name. Eventually, I heard him. Gillette was asking if I was okay. I told him I found something and that I needed a minute. He probably thought I was about to throw up, but I wasn't. My body was doing something else entirely, trying to be in 2 times at once. I was standing there in the October brush, staring at a body, and I was also sitting on a mossy log 4 years ago, in a gully, smelling nothing where there should have been something. This one was female. Small build, dark hair, mid-20s maybe. No match to either of the missing campers. It had that same incorrect freshness, and the same untouched skin and absence of smell, and that disinterest from insects, even though I saw them everywhere else. The mouth was open, the jaw wide, but this time the teeth were all there, every one of them, clean and white and in place. The jaw wasn't wrenched or torn, but open, relaxed open, if that makes sense. Sort of like someone falling asleep on a long car ride. Even so, it looked like the same thing. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever I'd found in that gully 4 years ago, here was another one, 12 miles north. I called it in. Gillette and I sat with it. He kept looking at me funny because I think my face was doing something I wasn't aware of. I asked him not to include that in his report, and he said, "Include what?" A good man. The ME's report came back 10 days later. I requested a copy, which I had to justify to my supervisor, a woman named Chloe, who was efficient and disinterested in anything that created extra paperwork. But I explained that I'd found a similar body years ago, and I wanted to compare notes. She gave me a look that lasted about 2 seconds too long, but then approved the request. Here are the notes. Cause of death undetermined. No trauma, no toxicology. Internal examination noted the same thing as the first. Reduced organ mass. The body was lighter than it should have been for its size, and this time the examiner added something new. Lacerations in the esophagus and upper trachea. Deep vertical scratches running from somewhere below where the stomach should have been, and up through the throat, like something with a rough surface had dragged itself through from the inside. The scratches were clean and dry. There was no blood or inflammation, no signs of healing. Whatever made them did it close to the time of death, or close to whatever we were calling death, since nothing about these bodies followed the rules of dying, or humanity for that matter. A thought came to mind when I finished reading the notes. that whatever had left the first body behind had gotten better at crawling out. The missing couple was never found. Their families called, and those calls followed the pattern I already knew from 4 years back. I had to sit in that office and listen to hope die again. I tried to connect the two cases officially. I wrote up a summary and kept it dry and factual, then submitted it to Chloe with a request, asking for it to be forwarded to the regional office for review. She read it in front of me and said, "These are two unidentified remains found 6 years apart in different locations. They have no apparent connection to each other or to any missing persons. What exactly do you want regional to do with this?" She wasn't being cruel. She was right. On paper, there was nothing to connect. I wanted to say that they're the same and they feel the same, that we're dealing with strange bodies that have nothing inside them and the same nothing around them, and that if you look closely that nothing about this makes sense. But you can't write that kind of stuff down in a federal report. This isn't some note in a survival horror game. So I just thanked her for the time and went back to my cabin, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. Three months later in January, Philip, Richard, and I pulled a 2-night backcountry assignment, a trail survey after a series of late fall storms. We had to check for washouts, downed trees blocking access, structural damage to the footbridges on the upper loop. It was a long enough route that camping made more sense than trying to rush it in a day. I almost asked to swap off the assignment. I'd been sleeping badly since October, worse than my usual bad, and the thought of 2 nights out there put a knot in my chest, which I couldn't have explained to anyone without sounding like I was going mad. But I didn't swap, because Philip and Richard were both on the roster and I trusted these guys, and also because my dad would have done the survey without even thinking twice. Even then, I was still measuring myself against a dead man's calm. I packed my bag and went. The first day was good, actually. Cold and clear, one of those January days where the air feels like it's been cleaned. We hiked the lower section, flagging 2 washouts and a bridge with a cracked stringer. We ate trail mix and jerky, and we made camp at a designated site on a flat bench above the creek around 4. Richard brought an absurd amount of food. Summer sausage, a few different kinds of cheeses, crackers, bags of those little mandarin oranges. He laid it all out on a flat rock like a buffet. Philip said it looked like a charcuterie board for people who shop at gas stations. Richard took that as a compliment and said thank you, that he had worked hard on it. We got a fire going as the light dropped. The temperature was falling, but the sky was clear and there was no wind, which is rare up there in the winter. The smoke went straight up. We sat on logs around the ring and ate too much of Richard's food, talking about nothing important. Philip was trying to convince Richard to watch some Korean horror movie that he said was the best thing he'd seen in 5 years. Richard said he didn't like scary movies because they made him feel bad for the characters. Philip said that that was the point, but Richard said no. He meant he'd feel bad for days afterward, and it would just ruin his week. Knowing Richard, I believed him. Around 8, the conversation hit one of those comfortable lulls where no one feels the need to fill it, and then Philip said, "You guys hear about Bud Gianelli?" Richard shook his head. I hadn't either. Philip poked at the fire with a stick and settled back. "He was here before either of you. Retired maybe a year before you started," he said, nodding towards me. A quiet guy, apparently. The old-timers said he almost never talked about himself. But there was this one thing he told a couple people, and it made the rounds. "Of course you know what it is, huh?" Richard said. "Of course I do." Philip snapped the stick in half and tossed the short end into the coals. So, Bud's doing a solo patrol in the upper North Fork. Late summer, maybe 05 or 06. Long day, nothing happening. He's heading back down and he comes around a switchback, and there's a guy on the trail about 50 feet ahead, just standing there. Bud calls out. The guy turns around and waits for him. "Okay." Richard said. They walk together for about a mile. Bud tries to make conversation. The guy answers, but barely. Just short replies. He doesn't volunteer anything. Bud figures he's just tired. Maybe he's one of those hikers who doesn't want to chat. No big deal. So they're walking, and at some point Bud stops to fix his boot. The laces came loose or whatever. He looks down for maybe 15 seconds. Philip paused. He looks back up. The guy is gone. Richard waited. Gone where? That's the thing. The trail was straight for 100 yards in both directions. No side trails, steep hillside on one side and a drop-off on the other. There was nowhere to go. The guy was just gone. He could have ducked into the trees to piss, Richard said. On a steep hillside with no shoulder, in 15 seconds, without making a sound, without Bud hearing a single footstep. Philip shrugged. Sure, maybe. Richard looked into the fire. Okay then, that's weird. It gets weirder. Bud told a couple guys about it over beers. They asked him what the man looked like, and he couldn't say. He'd start to describe the face and just trail off, like the memory wouldn't stay in his hands. After a few weeks, he could barely remember the encounter at all, just that it happened and that it bothered him. What do you mean he couldn't remember? I mean the details wouldn't stick. He knew there was a man, he knew they walked together, but the specifics kept sliding away. The face, the clothes, the voice, all of it just sort of dissolved. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The fire popped and sent a thread of sparks up into the dark. That's freaking creepy, Phil, Richard said. Philip grinned. I laughed, but I was thinking about the trail Bud had been on when it happened. Upper North Fork. The second body had been found about 2 miles from that section. I didn't say that. I sat with it and let the conversation move on. We turned in around 9:30. I was in my bag, Philip was in his tent, Richard was in his, and I was staring at the nylon ceiling trying to convince my brain to shut down, which is a negotiation I lose most nights. The creek was loud enough to cover the small sounds. It was peaceful. Otherwise, it was total silence out there. Without the creek, it would have been too unsettling for me to fall asleep. Out there at nights like this, you have to have something else to listen to. The downside was, though, that I could not hear what was moving around us. I don't know what time it was when I heard Richard's zipper. If I had to guess, I think it was around midnight. I heard him get out of his tent, footsteps on frozen ground, and I assumed he was going to take a piss. I almost went back to the half-asleep I'd been managing. Then I heard him say something. Not to me, but outward, toward the tree line. It sounded casual and friendly, like someone had wandered into the camp. Hey, you okay out there? You need some help? I was out of my bag quick. I unzipped my tent and the cold hit me, and I saw Richard standing about 20 feet from the fire ring. He was facing the trees to the north. He was looking at someone. I could see the shape of a person standing just past where the ember light gave out. They were about 40 yards from camp, in the trees, standing upright and still. I could tell they were facing us, but I could not see the face. I couldn't see much detail at all. I could see the outline, average height and average build. They stood like they were waiting for a bus. There was nothing overtly wrong with what we were looking at, and yet my whole body went cold anyway. Richard took a step toward the shape. Hey, do you need some... Richard. I said it too loud for the middle of the night, but I didn't care. He turned and looked at me, and I could see his face in the faint orange light. He looked confused, not scared. He hadn't felt that wrongness like I had yet. I said to him, "Come back to the fire, right now." He looked at me, then looked back at the figure. Something in my voice must have been enough. because he walked back to me without an argument, though he kept glancing over his shoulder. Philip was awake now too, sitting up in his tent with his headlamp on, asking what was happening. I told him there was someone at the edge of our camp. Philip put on his boots and grabbed his flashlight, then aimed it at the tree line. The moment the light hit, there was nothing there. The space where the figure had been was now empty, just trunks and branches in the dark. "What? I saw someone," Richard said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. "They were right there," he pointed. Philip swept the light back and forth. "Could have been a hiker, lost maybe." "They were just standing there," Richard said. "Well, did they say anything?" Philip asked. Richard started to answer, then stopped. His mouth opened and closed, and his eyes went somewhere far away for a second. Then he said, I think so, yeah. They said something, but I can't. It was hard to hear over the creek." I didn't ask what the figure had said. I didn't want to know if Richard had heard what I'd heard from my tent just before I came out, because I had heard something too. Under Richard's voice, under the creek, there had been something else, low and flat, a voice trying to sound normal, but I could hear something underneath, so faint I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Something that buzzed, a deep rumbly vibration like a wasp trapped in a cello. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was the worst thing I'd ever heard. "Let's keep the fire up," I said. "I'll take first watch." They were both fine with that. Philip got the fire rebuilt. Richard sat close to it and kept his headlamp on, aiming at the trees for the next hour, even though the fire was bright enough to see by. I sat with my back to the flames, watching the dark. I was shaking instead of sleeping. At first light, we packed up. I said I wanted to head back early, skip the second night, and nobody questioned it. Philip was quiet in the hike out, but it was different than his usual quiet. Richard was the opposite. He wouldn't shut up the whole way. He talked about the food he'd brought, the bridge that needed repairs, about the mariners' off-season moves. He reminded me of someone that wanted to fill the air with enough normal words that the abnormal might go away. A week later, I put in a request to be taken off overnight assignments for the rest of the season. My supervisor approved it. I think she assumed it was my anxiety, which, in a way, it was. 5 months later, in June, a day patrol ranger named Tate found a man sitting on a boulder near the Elk Creek trailhead, about 30 feet off the parking area. The man was sunburned and dehydrated. He had a cut on his forehead that had scabbed over badly, and he was sitting very still with his hands on his knees, staring at the gravel between his boots. Tate tried talking to him. The man looked up and told him, "I need to go home." Tate asked him his name and where he'd come from. The man answered both questions, but did not elaborate. He had been missing for 2 days, a solo hiker, backcountry permit, supposed to be on a 3-night loop through the upper draw. His car was in the parking lot, and his pack was gone. Tate called it in. The man was coherent enough that it wasn't a medical emergency, but he was clearly in rough shape. The man was hypothermic despite the June warmth and dehydrated, scratched up from off-trail travel. They brought him to the station and got him water and a blanket. Then they started the standard lost hiker debrief. Where did you leave the trail? When did you realize you were lost? Do you remember landmarks? He answered everything in short sentences. He'd left the trail at the Upper Fork Junction. He'd gotten turned around sometime the first afternoon and spent a night in the open. He found the creek the next morning and followed it down. A pretty typical lost story. The ranger doing the debrief wrote it up, and that would have been the end of it, except Tate mentioned it to Philip at shift change. It was an offhand comment. "We found a guy sitting by Elk Creek. Looked like he'd seen a ghost." Tate didn't mean it literally. It's just a saying after all. But Philip, you know how he has a nose for this stuff, he asked a couple of follow-up questions, and something about the answers made him come find me. "You should talk to this guy," Philip said. He was standing in the doorway of my cabin with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. The lost hiker from Elk Creek. He told Tate something about meeting another hiker on the trail before he got lost. Tate didn't push him on it, because the guy was pretty shut down by then, but the way he said it. I don't know, man. I think you should go talk to him. Philip didn't say why he thought I specifically should be the one to do it. He didn't reference the camping trip or that figure in the trees. We never really talked about that night much anyway. And yet he came to me. And I think that tells you something about what Philip knew without knowing it. The man was still at the station at the time. He'd refused a ride to the hospital and was sitting in the break room drinking a Gatorade, staring at the microwave. I pulled up a chair across from him, and I told him I was a ranger and that I'd heard he'd had a rough couple of days. I said I just wanted to make sure we had the full picture. I asked if he could tell me what happened from the beginning. He didn't even look at me right away. He was tugging at the label on the Gatorade bottle, nervously. Eventually he said, I met someone on the trail." I waited. His story came out slowly. He was on the upper fork about 4 miles in, moving slowly because his pack was heavy and the trail grade was steep. He came around a bend, and there was a man on the trail ahead of him, about 60 feet out, walking the same direction. He said the man had an average height and build. He wore a green jacket and jeans and had a pack on. The man heard him coming and turned around, waiting for him to catch up. He gave a little wave, too. Our survivor here waved back. They fell into step together. The man seemed normal at first and friendly. He said hello, said something about the weather, the standard trail small talk. The survivor asked where he was heading. The man gave an answer. The survivor told me he couldn't remember what the answer was. They walked together for maybe a quarter mile. The survivor did most of the talking. He told me he was a talker on the trail, liked to have company, and the other guy seemed to like having company. After a few minutes, he started to notice things, though. The man had a flat, level voice. Every word came out around the same pitch and the same volume, like the worst actor reading off a card. The survivor figured maybe the guy was just tired, maybe shy or not a native speaker. Then he described something that made my heart skip a couple beats. He said that there was something underneath the man's voice, a low hum or vibration, like the sound you hear when you're near a power transformer, a deep electrical buzz you can feel in your back teeth. Except it was coming from the man's chest or throat. He only noticed it during pauses in conversation when the man was not speaking, and even then it was faint. He told himself he was imagining it. But then, the eyes. The survivor tried to make eye contact, but couldn't. The man would turn his face toward him when he talked. The orientation was right. The head was aimed at his. The face was aimed at him. But the eyes were off. They'd be pointed at a spot just to the left of the survivor's face, or just above his forehead. When the survivor shifted, leaned a little or turned his head, the man's eyes did not track. They would adjust, but always to a different, wrong spot. It was like they were approximating where to look without understanding the concept. I remember the way he described it, like trying to make eye contact with a painting, and I liked that, though it was extremely creepy. Probably why I remember it after all this time. Said everything's facing you, but nothing's looking at you. The survivor stopped on the trail and told the man he needed to check his map. The man stopped too. This was the part where the survivor put the Gatorade bottle down and his hands went flat on the table. The man just stood there. He didn't take off his pack and he didn't sit down. He didn't drink any water. He just stopped moving and stood there on the trail facing the survivor, arms at his sides. He could have been a mannequin in a store window like that, completely lacking shifting weight or fidgeting. People don't stand perfectly still like that. People are always doing something. This man had stopped, and the stopping was complete. Like pausing a video, nothing like stopping mid-hike. The survivor said he stood there pretending to look at his map for about 30 seconds, and in that time, the man did not move once, did not blink, he did not breathe, or at least didn't see him breathing. But that buzz, it was still there, louder in that silence. He folded his map and put it back in his pocket. He told the man he had just realized he needed to double back because he had missed a junction. The man didn't respond right away, but soon he said, "Okay." Same flat tone. The survivor turned and started to walk back up the trail. He told me the worst part of the entire experience was the 15 seconds after he turned his back, because he didn't hear footsteps behind him. He didn't hear anything. He wanted so badly to run, but he kept his composure and walked briskly, without looking back. He left the trail at the first game path he found and pushed into the brush and kept going. That's when he got completely and hopelessly lost. He spent the night under a Douglas fir with no shelter and no fire. He barely slept. Twice during the night, he swears he heard someone call his name from the trees. Clear, calm, his first name, spoken in that level tone from before. He told me he had never given the man his name. He said he was sure about it, would swear his life on that fact. I talk too much on the trail. I know that. I told the man where I was from. I told him about my dog. I told him about the drive up. But I'm telling you, I never gave him my name. I know I didn't. Because right before I got off the trail, I was thinking, why did he never ask? Most people ask. I then asked if the other hiker followed him off the trail. He said he didn't think so. He never saw the man again after he turned his back. But both times his name was called, it came from a different direction. The first call was uphill to the east. The second was downhill to the west. Both calls sounded the same distance away. I didn't say anything after he finished. I was kind of turning it over in my head. He kept peeling at the Gatorade label again. He'd gotten most of it off by now, and was now working at the adhesive residue with his thumbnail, scraping it into little gray rolls on the table. I watched him do it, and I didn't trust myself to speak yet. I took a few deep breaths. Then I asked him one more question. I asked if the man's eyes had ever looked directly at him, even once, even for just a split second. He thought about his answer for a very long time before he gave it. But finally he said, No, I don't think he ever did." I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table, pulling up both ME reports on my laptop. I read them carefully, side by side. The first body. The teeth were pushed out, jaw forced open, mostly empty inside. The second body, the jaw was open, teeth intact, throat scratched from the inside, also mostly empty inside. And now we had a living witness who had walked beside something that couldn't make eye contact, could not modulate its voice, which stood like nothing on earth stands when it wasn't moving. Forgive me, but I'm gonna tell you what I think is happening. I obviously don't have all the evidence for this. I have 2 bodies and a camping trip, and a delirious hiker who heard his own name called from the dark by something he had never given it to. In terms of evidence, that's all I have to go on. But anyway, what do I think? Well, I think something is out there in the deep back country, in the parts of the forest where the trails thin out and the canopy closes and you can walk for 8 hours without seeing another human soul. I think, whatever it is, it builds these things, these bodies. They're more like suits to it. I don't know what it builds them from, and I don't know how. I think it wears them and walks out there to where people are, and it tries its best to look like one of us. And I think it's been doing this for a long time. The first suit was crude. It climbed out and broke the teeth on its way through, leaving the jaw wrenched open, and it didn't care. But the second one was better, cleaner. The teeth stayed put. The exit was more controlled. The only sign that anything had passed through was the scratching inside the throat, and you would need an autopsy to find that. Because of all of this, I think about what the third one might look like. Whether there will be anything left to find at all, or whether it'll just stand up and walk to a trailhead, get in a car, and drive somewhere, sitting down at a kitchen table across from someone who has been waiting for it to come home. I'm reminded of that Bud Gianelli story, about him walking a mile beside a man whose face he couldn't remember a week later. I wonder if Bud noticed the eyes or the voice, and just filed it away as something the woods didn't owe him an explanation for. Maybe Bud was lucky. Or maybe he just wasn't what it was looking for that day. Frequently, I think about what Richard, Philip, and I saw in the tree line that night. There was no mistaking that there was someone out there. But was it really someone that needed help? Or was it something else? I'm terrified to think about what would have happened if none of us had woke up. Or if I had never stopped Richard from walking towards it. By morning, would there have been one more empty suit in the brush? One of our tents now permanently empty? Before I leave you, I want to say that if you hike alone in the backcountry, I'm not going to tell you to just stop doing it. People have been walking in these woods for thousands of years, and most people walk back out just fine. What I am trying to say is, if you meet someone else on the trail, and something feels very wrong, if the voice doesn't sit right with you, or the eyes never quite meet yours, trust that feeling. Those feelings exist in you for a reason. Being rude is much better than going missing forever. Turn around, walk away, and don't look back. Take that final message to heart. The next time you run into someone on a hiking trail, or on the side of the road, and they act just a little weird, you might be dealing with something rather than someone. And that something might lead you into the woods to never be found. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Help us out by leaving a follow and review of Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You can even find more of my scary narrations on my other podcast, Tales from the Break Room, which is also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you have a scary story of the unknown, send it to me at darkstories.org. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.